All right, round two. On our follow-up on addictions, we're going to be talking about freedom in the New Testament. Yesterday, I was showing you how we were talking together, if you were talking along with me, about how the Old Testament gives us a picture of addiction in the terminology of slavery and the way that God redeems us from that slavery. The New Testament really borrows this language in talking about redemption and describes really two ways in which Christians can be free, and then points to Jesus as the solution for both of those. So I want to show you a little bit of that just to kind of continue this conversation, and then we'll pick up with some practicals tomorrow in part 3 of this. But moving on, looking at what we talked about yesterday, we used the imagery of Exodus and the Promised Land, and talked about how on the journey from slavery to rest, we experience these moments where there's cravings, there's hungers, there's desires that seem legitimate, kind of like being thirsty or being hungry that the Israelites had in the Old Testament. And the option that's there of either relying on God for bread and daily provision, which we saw yesterday was a picture of Christ, or turning back to Egypt, which is the metaphor that we were using for why Christians might give in to things that seem addictive or enslaving. So using that imagery, the New Testament then picks up on the idea of redemption and really helps us to think through this question. For us who have left the land of slavery and who once were ruled by idols, but at our moments of hunger, why is it we go back? Why is it that we voluntarily, if we're free, still submit to sin's domain? And so that's a question we want to ask. Biblically speaking, if we're free, why would we submit? So look at the way that Romans 6 describes this in the beginning. It says in verse 5, if we've been united with him in a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. We know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing for this reason, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. That's Paul describing for the Romans the idea of our battle with sin, and the language he uses is slavery. Peter does the same thing. He says they, then the they here is false teachers. They promise them, the people that they're teaching, freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption. And he describes that principle this way. He says, whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. But what we know from really Jesus' whole mission is described there in the beginning of Luke. When Jesus reads a passage from the Old Testament, he essentially applies it to his own mission and says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me. He's sent me to proclaim liberty to captives and to set at liberty those who are oppressed. So if that's why Jesus has come, then really, Paul's not wrong in saying to Titus, we ourselves, we were once foolish, disobedient, led astray, slaves to various passions and pleasures, passing our day in malice and envy, hated by others and hating one another. But when the goodness and loving kindness of God our Savior appeared, he saved us. And the question is, what are we saved from? Well, the first thing we're saved from is sin's domain. We're saved from being enslaved to passions and pleasures that may have once ruled us. So if we are free, the question is, why do we go back, right? Why then? Because sometimes what Paul says here in Romans is we may misunderstand grace altogether, because the idea of being set free from slavery seems like if God could set us free from slavery of Egypt, why not just go back so that God could continue to set us free? And Paul says in Romans 6, that's ridiculous. Should we sin because we're not under law but under grace? Well, by no means. Don't you know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one to whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness. So what Paul identifies for the believer who's been set free is the question is, because you now have freedom of which master to choose, which isn't a freedom that a slave has, you instead voluntarily give yourself over either to sin or, in this case he says here, to obedience. Now, sin would be an odd thing to give yourself over to because we know that leads to death. Obedience would be the logical master to choose because that leads to righteousness. But the question is, how do we kind of get out of this? Well, that's what he continues on in verse 17. He says, "Thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you are committed, and have been set free from sin, having been set free from sin, you have become slaves of righteousness. For just as you once presented your members as slaves to impurity and to lawlessness, leading to more lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves to righteousness, leading to sanctification." So you see there in just those few verses in Romans 6, what Paul does in identifying this language and saying, you have been set free, but the issue is, to whom will you now present yourself for your mastery? What he doesn't say, notice, isn't, okay, stop presenting yourself to sin, and that's the end of it. So in other words, what we aren't trying to encourage is just the breaking of sin's mastery. That's not the most effective way of getting there. What he does is he puts both of these together and says, first, well, why would we submit ourselves to sin's domain if we'd be free from it? In other words, why go back to a master who beats you and kills you? That's what sin does. But instead, what he says is, because you've been set free, you now have the option of presenting your members as slaves to righteousness, leading to sanctification. So with those paradigms set there, what we might think is that the main thing we need to do is set up a whole mess of rules for our life so that we don't present our members as slaves to sin, but instead we present ourselves as slaves to righteousness. But that's not exactly what the Bible gives us in the New Testament as a picture of what real freedom is. Because if the first question is, why would we submit ourselves to sin's domain? The second question is really, and this is the second way that freedom is described in the New Testament, why would we submit ourselves to sin's curse? Look at the way that Galatians kind of answers this question, or asks this question. It says, "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you've come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more?" In other words, what Paul's talking about here to the Galatians isn't, why are you under sin's dominion? He's asking the question of, even if you want to be free from sin altogether, why go back to an entire system of slavery, which is really what legalism is? In other words, then, the answer of beating sin's power in our life is not simply trying to ask the question of how do we become less enslaved by finding out the rules that will re-enslave us. Instead, the question is, how do we become less enslaved to sin? How do we present ourselves not to sin and to the death that results from it, but how do we present ourselves to God? And his initial answer is, well, it's not going to be by doing all the same stuff you were doing before. Look at the way that this was summed up as we were just looking at this in Colossians a couple weeks ago. Remember, he said this: "If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world," and think back, this similar principles there in Galatians, the worthless elementary principles of the world. He's using spiritual language here, but he's getting at the same thing, these regulations that are there. If you've died to all that, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? What Paul said to the Colossians is, all those laws that you would think make you more godly really have no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. In other words, all the rules in the world are not going to prevent you from going back to sin. That's paradigm shifting if we really think about it. Because what we want to do is say, well, I don't want to live under sin's power and influence anymore. So what I need to do is set up all the rules and regulations in my life so I don't do that again. But that's not the way this plays out. Because in Galatians 3, Paul already said this. He said, Look, all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. For here's how it's written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them. Now it's evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. But the law is not of faith. Rather, the one who does them shall live by them. So what Christ did is Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. That's a reference to an Old Testament law that talks about people being cursed by hanging on a tree, much like Christ did, exactly like Christ did in dying on the cross for us. Now, he redeemed us from this curse so that in Christ, the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles. Now, think about the blessing of Abraham. How did God bless Abraham? Was it by him obeying all the law? The law didn't even exist when God was going to bless Abraham. The blessing of Abraham, we know from a bunch of different places, really comes because Abraham heard what God said and believed it. And it was that believing that was going to be the means by which not only would Abraham be blessed, but all of us would be blessed. We're not going to be blessed by God because we perfectly obey a system of rules and regulations and practices that are going to prevent us from ever sinning again. That never works. In fact, it brings about a curse. Instead, this all happens so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. You see, the question that really needs to be answered in trying to address how are we not going to live under sin's domain and how are we not going to live under the curse of sin, or to say it differently, how are we not going to live so that sin rules us, and how are we not going to use all of our man-made regulations in order to prevent sin from ruling us? Since we're free, what Galatians offers instead is, well then, why not live as sons? Rather than living as slaves who are just trying to prevent us going back all the time from this old master, why not instead live as sons? Galatians 4 says it this way. God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you're sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you're no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. You see, we could kind of read this, particularly if you're a woman listening to this, and you might ask the question, could I just substitute in the word daughters here? You can, in the sense that it reminds us that God isn't just dealing in a patriarchal way. But because this is written to a patriarchal society, the use of sons actually matters a lot here. Because when God says there in the end of that bolded section, so that we might receive adoption as sons, he's not just talking about being a child, he's talking about being an heir. And in this society when Paul was writing, the only people who inherited stuff were the males, were the sons. And that right isn't just given to male Christians today, it's given to all Christians today. So there's a sons and daughters that carries the legal, historical weight of being a son of God. Because we are sons and daughters of God, we get the right, not of simply being people who live under the rules of God's household and by our obedience to those rules somehow earn God's favor, because we all know that's impossible. We're never going to keep the rules well enough. Instead, the freedom that we're going to be able to access through faith is going to be because God sends his Spirit into our hearts and empowers us to live freely, because he wants to remind us that God sees us as more than just those who are rule keepers, just obedient slaves, but as those who have been fundamentally changed into the kingdom, into being his children and into being his heirs. That principle matters tremendously. We want to be free from sin's power, but we also want to be free from the law's power. So how do we get to that point? Well, that's what we'll try to pick up in our section 3 tomorrow. Thanks.